Can everyone hear me? Good. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ken Feitlowitz. I'm the director of the Dickey Center for International Understanding, and I'm delighted to welcome you here to this very, very special program today, which celebrates the work of the 2005 Chase Peace Prize Senior Thesis Competition winner, Cortelyou Kenney. She prefers Court, and that's exactly the way I'm going to refer to her, as Court. I did want also at this particular juncture, because she came all the way across the country to observe this wonderful ceremony, to recognize Court's mother, Ann Emmerich, who's with us. Ann, why don't you stand up and be recognized? Good. Glad to have you. Each year, the Dickey Center offers the Chase Peace Prize for the best senior thesis written by a student of the college relating to the causes of war and peace, and war and prospects for peace in the world. The winner of the competition receives a monetary award, which is important, but more importantly, in my judgment, the opportunity for his or her work to be evaluated and discussed by experts in the field of their thesis topic. This event really is one of our favorite events of the year, both because it addresses a very important issue, war and prospects for peace, but it also highlights the truly outstanding achievements of students like Court. We're very proud to be able to offer the Chase Peace Prize, created in 1939 through a bequest by Edward M. Chase. The gift now permits us to offer two prizes, one for an undergraduate essay on the topic of war and peace, and the other for the best senior thesis. Both prizes allow us to meet the aim of the original bequest, to foster careful reflection on the causes of war and prospects for peace in the world. Edward Chase, whose legacy created this program, was a Lithuanian native who settled in New Hampshire and established a thriving furniture concern in Manchester. His financial success was accompanied by a lasting interest in philanthropy, especially in the fields of education and housing for the working man, and in nearly every phase of Jewish religious and communal welfare. While not himself college educated, Mr. Chase ensured that his children and grandchildren would receive first-rate educations, and through his bequests, created essay contests at 3 colleges, Harvard, Dartmouth, and at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. The Chase Peace Prize has encouraged generations of Dartmouth students to pay attention to the problems of collective violence which continue to threaten humanity. We have even had a former Chase Prize recipient return as an expert discussant for a younger generation prize recipient. We are especially pleased to be able to recognize the diverse ways in which the problems of war and peace can be addressed. This year's Senior Thesis Award recipient, Court Kenney, was a comparative literature major at Dartmouth, whose senior thesis addressed the role of art and theater in Argentina during the period of state repression known as the Dirty War. We encourage students from all the disciplines to consider submitting their thesis or culminating experience work for this prize. And I might just remind seniors in the audience that this year's competition deadline is June 1st. I also just want to take the opportunity to, and with Court's permission, to mention an upcoming lecture that I think would also be of particular interest to this audience. On May the 3rd, the Dickey Center, working in cooperation with the Tucker Foundation and the Jewish Studies program, will have the inaugural social justice issues lecture in honor of Rabbi Marshall Meyer, class of 1952 of Dartmouth. He worked very extensively in Argentina during the same period that Cort is going to be talking about. And he worked and in effect helped save the life of Jacobo Timmerman, a well-known Argentinian journalist. And this first lecture on May 3rd at 4:30 will be in Dartmouth 105, but it will be given by Ambassador Hector Timmerman, who is the Argentinian Consul General in New York, and he will talk about Rabbi Meyer, his work, and also the intersection with his own father, Jacobo Timmerman. And now to introduce our prize winner and to moderate and introduce the panel of expert discussants, I'm very pleased to present to you one of Cort's thesis advisor, Mary Coffey. Professor Coffey is an assistant professor of art history, specializing in American art, and she is associated with the program on women and gender studies here at Dartmouth. Professor Coffey, welcome.
I'm not sure which of these is, can you hear me? Yeah? Okay. Well, welcome this afternoon. Thanks for coming out, and thank you to the Dickey Center for providing us with this great forum to honor Cort and her tremendous work last year, and to bring her back and give us all the pleasure of having her company for just a little while longer before she goes off and does great things in the world. Can you, okay, now you can hear me. All right, well, as Ken said, I'm Mary Coffey, and I teach art history in the Department of Art History here at Dartmouth College. And I'll be serving as moderator this evening, providing introductions for our three speakers and facilitating the question and answer period at the conclusion of their remarks. It gives me great pleasure to introduce our distinguished presenters, in particular because tonight's event culminates what has been one of the most rewarding advising experiences of my professional career to date. We are here to celebrate Cortelyou Kenney's award-winning senior honors thesis, completed in 2004 in the Department of Comparative Literature. In addition to winning the Chase Peace Prize, Cort's thesis titled Unveiling the Scaffolding Behind State Terror, Norberto Gomez's Las Carnes and Griselda Gambaro's Decir Sí, was also granted the Charles R. Bernheimer Prize for, quote, research that has made the best use of innovative approaches to the discipline of comparative literature, end quote. As will become clear, Cort's thesis combines astute visual and textual analysis with a sophisticated theoretical engagement with the effects of state violence on cultural expression and its reception at the moment of its production, exhibition, or performance, but also over time and in retrospect as scholars and citizens alike attempt to reconstruct a public memory that can make sense of the experience of everyday life under regimes of torture, terror, or violence. Since graduating from Dartmouth College summa cum laude in 2004, Cortelyou Kenney has been working as a legal intern in Santiago, Chile for the Corporation for the Promotion and Defense of the People's Rights, which is a human rights organization founded in 1980 to oppose the Pinochet regime and to provide legal services for the victims of state execution and torture. Cort is currently in the final stages of the law school application process, entertaining numerous offers from some of the most prestigious universities in the country, in pursuit of a career in international human rights work. In addition to her many impressive internships and academic achievements, Cort has also been an active contributor to women's organizations at Dartmouth College as a member of the Subtleties, Dartmouth's all-female a cappella group, and Phoenix, which is a social organization dedicated to promoting women's issues on campus. Her maturity, sense of adventure, and independence as a thinker are matched only by her incredible commitment to ethical and compassionate action in the world. I think it is this combination that convinced the Dickey Center to award her the Chase Peace Prize, and it will become evident in her remarks this evening, as well as those by the remarkable scholars who have graciously agreed to join us in celebration of this honor, and who have graciously agreed to read Cort's senior thesis and comment on it. I will introduce our guest speakers in the order of their presentations, and afterwards there will be plenty of time for question and answer, so I ask that you reserve your remarks or questions until everyone's had a chance to present their comments. So our second speaker this evening, seated at the end of the table here, is Marguerite Feitlowitz, who is the author of an internationally acclaimed book titled A Lexicon of Terror, Argentina and the Legacies of Torture. This book was a New York Times notable book of 1998 and a notable paperback of 1999, as well as a finalist for the 1999 PEN New England L.L. Winship Prize. Her fiction, poetry, essays, art criticism, and translations have appeared in Bomb, Tri-Quarterly, Salmagundi, Le Temps Moderne, El Viejo Topo, City Lights Review, The Literary Review, and numerous other journals and anthologies in the Americas, Europe, and Israel. She has held 2 Fulbright Fellowships to Argentina, including a 1999 Senior Scholar Award, a Bunting Fellowship in Nonfiction, and a Harvard Faculty Research Grant. In the spring of 1994, she was a visiting scholar at Hebrew University in Jerusalem. She has published 3 volumes of literary translations from French and Spanish. Marguerite Feitlowitz previously taught at Harvard University, but since 2002, she's taught at Bennington. She received her BA from Colgate University and Université de Dijon. And our final speaker this evening is international critic and curator Ines Katzenstein. Ines Katzenstein received a master's degree from the Center for Curatorial Studies at Bard College in New York in 2001 with the aid of grants given by the Fondo Nacional de las Artes and the Fundación Antorchas Argentina. She has written on contemporary art for different magazines and catalogs and edited several important publications on Argentine art, including, turn the page, Guillermo Cuitca, Drawings, which was published in 1997, Ernesto Katzenstein, Arquitecto, which was published in 1999, and a very important volume of texts on critical writings by Argentinian theorists, critics, and artists entitled Listen, Here, Now, Argentine Art of the 1960s, Writings of the Avant-Garde, which was published by the Museum of Modern Art in New York in 2004. In addition to her publications, Ines Katzenstein has curated exhibitions on contemporary artists such as Liliana Porter, Fotografía y Ficción in 2003, and David Lamelas, Extranjero, Foreigner, Étranger, Auslander at the Museo Tamayo in 2005. She is currently curator at the Malba Collection, Constantini in Buenos Aires. So join me in welcoming our speakers, and we'll turn the podium over to Court.
Does this work? Hello. Thank you all for coming. I am so honored to be here and to share the podium with 2 incredibly gifted cultural critics, Ines Katzenstein and Marguerite Feitlowitz. I would also like to acknowledge Professor Mary Coffey for moderating and the Dickey Center for flying me all the way from South America to be here today. In a strangely symbolic way, April 17th marks almost a year to the day since my thesis defense. After finishing it, I was so emotionally and physically exhausted that I wanted to forget about the whole process as soon as possible. I put my thesis in the basement of my house in California and flew to Chile, grateful that I would never have to think about anything remotely related to it ever again. I guess we all know how that turned out. But time has given me a chance to let things marinate, to consider my topic in the context of the advocacy work I've been doing, and to reflect on the power of art and literature to address human rights violations around the world. I've realized that a lot of what I wrote was slightly short-sighted, not because I devoted an insufficient amount of time and energy to research and writing, but because I lacked that critical distance that comes with the passage of time. Today, I hope to rectify this and to present my work in the context of broader artistic and sociological trends. I'm also going to take a piece of advice my thesis advisor gave me when I started writing. She said, "Kill your children." Although I obviously don't endorse prolicide, I think it's a useful metaphor for the gestation of scholarship. In that vein, I'm only going to present one portion of my work today, which is the sculptural series Las Carnes, created by Norberto Gomez, in his effort to represent and resist the Argentine Dirty War. The fusion of art and politics is nothing new. Since time immemorial, Homo sapiens have felt the impulse to express themselves, to paint, sculpt, and etch their realities, including, and perhaps especially, violence. Masters from Rubens to Durer to Goya have devoted large portions of their careers to the topic, using their canvases as a means of coming to terms with it and moving beyond it. Their focus on the graphic nature of violence, piles of skulls, hordes of mutilated, decaying bodies, ubiquitous blood and gore, was not merely informational. That is to say, the artists intended to criticize governmental actions by laying bare the atrocities for all to see. This often jeopardized the physical well-being of said figures. Indeed, history is replete with examples of murdered cultural dissidents who protested via aesthetic means, from the Spanish poet Garcia Lorca to the Chilean folk rock singer Victor Jara. But it also allowed them to alter public opinion and frequently to incite resistance against the brutalities at hand. This trend holds true across all periods of time throughout all parts of the globe, in revolutionary France, in World War I Germany, and in the Vietnam conflict, as well as in Latin American countries under military regimes, Brazil, Uruguay, and of course, in Argentina. If I can get my slides to work. This last instance is my focus today. I analyze cultural responses to Argentina's process of national reorganization, commonly referred to as the Dirty War, a period of state-sponsored violence spanning 1976 to 83, where 30,000 civilians were killed and still more were brutally tortured. There are several reasons why I think the era and the scholarship that I focus on are particularly deserving of scholarship. First, Latin America continues to remain outside the art historical canon. During my 4 years at Dartmouth, the art history department did not offer a single course on South American art. While the situation has greatly improved with the hire of my fabulous advisor, Mary Coffey, there is still a long way to go, both within the confines of Hanover and beyond. Second, despite the effort that I've gone through to establish how art almost always pops up amidst violent and repressive regimes, a widespread belief persists that cultural opposition during the Dirty War did not exist. While artifacts of resistance continue to be unearthed, Norberto Gomez has yet to receive serious attention. Hopefully this panel can serve as an inspiration for further scholarship. Third, from a purely formal standpoint, Gomez's sculptures are some of the most powerful I have ever seen, surpassing even San Huang's works in sheer gross-out factor. Seeing Las Carnes, which translates as the flesh or meat, is a bit like stepping into a slaughterhouse. Upon entering the gallery, viewers are bombarded with representations of decaying carcasses and internal organs strewn across the floor and suspended from walls. Excruciatingly explicit allusions to bones, blood, cartilage, fat, skin, gristle, and lymphatic fluids appear so realistic that viewers can almost smell seared flesh. Finally, Las Carnes not only exposed state atrocities, it unveiled and deconstructed the social scaffolding which enabled them to occur in the first place. The series inverted the dictatorship's image of wealth, health, and nationalism, tangibly illustrating how these symbols have become tools of oppression. In particular, Gomez's use of the asado, or barbecue, as the central metaphor of his pieces, showed how the military regarded subversives as animals to be herded, slaughtered, sliced up, ingested, and expelled by the body politic. It is this point which I want to examine in depth, and which I believe is truly the cornerstone and the scholastic ground broken by my thesis. In order to fully grasp the significance of this metaphor, it is necessary to have a little background on the role of beef in Argentine culture. Carne asada feeds Argentina both literally and economically, serving as a principal export and a major source of jobs. The country also has the highest per capita beef consumption in the world, nearly double that of the United States. As a result, the asado has near universal resonance in Argentina. It has been used to signify the red-blooded masculinity of gauchos and cattle herders who civilized the country's pampas. The trope has also been taken up by Argentine authors and artists as a result of the nation's historical relationship to violence. The country's first novel, El Matadero, The Slaughterhouse, is devoted to this theme. In the book, a carnicero, or butcher, allegorically represents the brutal dictator Juan Manuel de Rosas, who is himself originally a cattle rancher. The asado was a particularly powerful metaphor during the Dirty War. Soldiers discussed torture, killing, and cremation using a vocabulary rooted in food preparation. Burning dead prisoners, for instance, was referred to as having a barbecue. Drawing heavily on these carnivorous tendencies, Gomez's works engage not only the physical act of eating, but also the canonization of meat throughout Argentine history. This series illustrated how groups on the periphery of society, leftists, intellectuals, and hippies, were treated as if they were slabs of beef. The work suggested that these individuals were deemed inhuman and as a result expendable by the dictatorship. In turn, they were herded like animals, cut, grilled, and ingested and expelled from the social corpus. In Argentine Spanish, the word carne is multivalent, variously translated as flesh, meat, or beef. However, in the context of the asado, the term specifically referred to non-living entities. In picking it to refer to his works, Gomez made it clear that the animals or humans they represent have already been deemed dead in the minds of their oppressors, reduced from animate to passive and from subject to object. The glowing material and spatial arrangements of the works underscore this point. In many instances, it was as if, as implied by the title of his series, Gomez were actually sculpting in flesh rather than in polyester resins. Las Barrillas have a wet luminosity, seemingly dripping with a transparent liquid and a red blood-like substance. Like Aztec sacrifices extracted from human beings at the moment of death, the sculpture retains a warm, pulsating energy. Small display spaces force the viewer into a nearly digestive relationship with the work. We participate in the ritual by visually devouring the sculptures through analysis and intellectual internalization. Harvard theorist Gordon Teskey argues this reduction of the body to meat involves the dispossession of the voice at both a literal and metaphorical level. He posits, only when voice is denied them do bodies lose this interiority, becoming an indifferent substance ready to be imprinted by ideology. While victims of Picasso's Guernica retain their humanity even as they are killed by screaming in a last act of defiance, Gomez's use of the asado illustrates how the Argentine regime frequently denied its prisoners even the liberty of making noise. Although many found creative ways to subvert their wardens and to reclaim the power of speech, the military's animalistic conception of its victims was incredibly effective as a silencing mechanism. Like animals, subversives were handled without dignity and herded into crowded and dirty prison camps, denied basic amenities such as food and water. The twisted and eviscerated carcasses displayed in pieces such as Quemado, where blackened remains weave their way in and out of the earth, are suggestive of this reality, as well as of the ultimate objectification achieved by death itself. That the protagonist has already died is significant. Its frozen and immobile status, partially a result of the sculptural medium, but also an intentional artistic choice as evidenced by its positioning in a defensive and subjugated posture, illustrates its symbolic silence. This point is emphasized by the allusion to mass cremation techniques employed by the dictatorship to erase evidence of its crimes. The fact that the figure is burned beyond recognition also suggests the denial of the expressive potential even in death. Erased from the world, its bones and flesh are so disfigured that they bear no resemblance to anything human. Similarly, in Colgado, the viewer can only see the back of the sculpture's skull. The work's facelessness suggests the loss of individual identity, but also a literal inability to confront oppression. Its bound wrists and cross-like status powerfully illustrate its silence and martyrdom. Dentadura, denture, is an even more obvious example. The jaw is the inactive artifact of violence, rather than an instrument capable of producing sound or movement. More notably, however, the work bears the anatomical marks of a missing tongue, containing folds of cartilage which suggest its violent removal and, by extension, the suppression of speech. The series also exposes the process of serialization inherent to mass violence. Like animal intestines used for sausages, all subversives were believed to originate from the same beast, and hence to merit identical treatment. Any differences were visually erased by the dictatorship, just as prisoners were herded together like animals, stripped of their clothing, and made to move at similar speeds. The surface of Las Barrillas is woven into one large unit where individual characteristics are subsumed by intricate braiding and blood. In the traditional asado, as practiced by gauchos, gigantic barbecue pits or grills are constructed to cook large quantities of steak, typically eaten in a mass-feeding frenzy. While distinct cuts are grilled and prepared differently, once placed in the fire, they are essentially indistinguishable, as can be seen in the photographs that I show. Similarly, if one carefully scrutinizes Las Barrillas, it is possible to detect bumps, ridges, and color variations indicative of different types of flesh, but the size of the works makes these blend together. Thus, while the scale reminded viewers of the sordid details of the dirty war, they also suggest the process by which these details were hidden and concealed through the forceful homogenization of subversives. Las Barrillas also elucidate the corporeal fragmentation and reassembly involved in the process of dehumanization. Like the dictatorship's nationalistic rhetoric and the inhuman conditions of detention centers, this focus provided a kind of psychic detachment. It also bore resemblance to the asado, where cuts of beef are chosen based on the section of the animal, carefully trimmed to remove excess fat, and divided into discrete, palatable portions. The clearly articulated, bright red ends of Las Barrillas suggest an interrupted relationship to a larger organic entity. The overflowing liquid in the sculpture recalls a similar lack of connecting vessels and implies the inherent violence of separation. Its tangled format also depicts an artificial process of national reorganization, where fragments are placed according to the cook/torturer. The fragmentation of Las Carnes illustrates how physical parts come not to stand for the whole, but to replace and efface it. Although the sculptures clearly function on metonymical and allegorical levels, alluding to the existence of parent bodies as well as to the overall political situation, the work simultaneously attempt to demonstrate the marked absence of these elements. The series intentionally excludes representations of complete entities. Most pieces portray a kidney, lung, arm, torso, leg, or intestinal tract, as can be seen in Organo. Notably, the sculptures closest to achieving wholeness depict partial skeletons, as in Quemado. The incomplete status of the series suggests society's myopic focus on subversive elements and ignorance of the larger political picture. That the pieces are done in series also illustrates how a larger theme or idea has been broken down into discrete components which can be moved around and separated into different collections and exhibitions at will. The contrast between the two types of sculptures, those depicting skeletons and those depicting internal organs, is the essence of this idea. Especially when placed next to one another, the suggestion that the latter derives from the former is inescapable. Fresh body parts do not exist in a vacuum, but have been torn from living bodies. The bones also have a history. They have been violently deprived of the flesh which gives them life. This point is heightened by a discharge of interiority. Internal parts among Gomez's sculpture mirror the perceived threats inside the social corpus. Government agents during the Dirty War referred to political dissidents as a cancer on the body politic. Like a patient's innards displayed on a surgeon's table, secret files were exposed and the private lives of citizens placed in the open. Similarly, torture sought to extract information perceptually more valuable than the minds that contained it. Known as operating amphitheaters and intensive therapy chambers, the chambers brought the most personal and intimate facts about victims to light, psychologically turning them inside out in a game of cat and mouse. Similarly, Las Barrillas and Colgado illustrate a process of corporeal unwrapping, exposing the vulnerable and vital parts to be processed by the butcher/state. Las Carnes also examines the cannibalistic character of governmental violence. As Teskey notes, the ultimate danger of political reaction is that of being devoured. He continues, "The scandal is that our bodies live by incorporating other bodies, by taking real and intense pleasure in every stage of the act, from the hunt to excretion." The central subject of the series almost tautologically illustrates the relationship of torture to consumption. After all, the primary purpose of the asado was not to burn corpses, but to prepare food. The aesthetic of the sculptures also suggests aspects of ingestion. The large blood-stained incisors on dentadura, for example, give the work a double meaning, implying not only a deprivation of voice, but also a hungry and carnivorous appetite. This interpretation is also supported by Colgado, in which the remains of the Christ-like figure hang on the wall, most likely after its meat has been devoured. Those turned into objects and slabs of meat were ultimately used as fuel for the regime. Only through incorporation could the state reestablish the boundaries of the social corpus which subversives threatened and disturbed. Finally, Gomez's works demonstrated not only the physical dependence on sustenance, but a pleasure in consumption. While repulsive, Las Carnes revealed a paradoxical human attraction to violence. Although nauseating, Manani had a sensual, even beautiful quality. Sin Titulo Numero 8, in particular, appeared almost ethereal. Its transparent folds glow as if backlit by the sun, and its shape echoes a pair of wings. Its snaking lines, deep red interior, and numerous orifices cause viewers to visually caress and penetrate it, giving the sculpture an overtone of jouissance. That these works magnetize viewers even as they repulse them is highly significant. It suggests a type of violation metaphorically reminiscent of the treatment of prisoners. Subversives were not just objective and reviled, but possessed and desired. Military members often took pleasure in sexually torturing their male and female victims. Professor Feitlowitz quotes one particularly graphic account of a dirty war prisoner. At night, the female voice would arrive, a well-known officer from the Gendarmeria who spoke in falsetto. The first thing he would do was to stroke one's testicles in anticipation of the pleasure of his task. While Gomez was probably unaware of these events at the time, Las Carnes did display a generalized awareness of pleasure via bodily incorporation. Indeed, some critics have argued that Las Barrillas depicted castrated animal testicles. The sculptures suggested that consumption and penetration were fundamentally analogous, each involving corporeal union and separation rooted in pleasure and objection. The active visual interaction between subject and object also suggests an aspect of human nature, in turn responsible for historical patterns of violence manifest globally as well as in Argentina. That audiences may experience feelings of joy and sexual arousal and destruction is indicative of the human capacity for cruelty. Indeed, pleasure and pain are not discrete according to the series. As Las Carnes illustrate, the two are intimately bound together, coexisting in many of the same pieces. Desire is not the flip side of repulsion, but rather a component of it. As theorist Julia Kristeva explains, the abject is edged with the sublime. It is not the same moment on the journey, but it is the same subject and speech which bring them into being. While Gomez does not suggest that humans are helpless in the face of their own impulses, his works certainly imply that what has partially permitted the objectification, fragmentation, and consumption of others is precisely the pleasurable aspect of destruction. Las Carnes constituted an amazing response to the atrocities of the Dirty War. The pieces placed in the open the brutalities which had been hidden from view by a culture of fear and of silence. The sculptures not only laid bare the violence of the period, but also engaged the factors which permitted it to occur in the first place. In particular, the series used the trope of the asado to tap into a network of cultural associations between consumption and violence, analyzing the events of the era even as they occurred. The metaphor carried much cultural currency at the time, given the literary tradition of which it formed a part, as well as the importance of the meat-eating ritual. Through Las Carnes, audiences came to see that torture victims were all around them, fragmented, silenced, and expelled. Ultimately, they re-signified crisis using alternative vocabularies, creating an alphabet of survival which debunked the mythic discourse of the military regime. Unfortunately, Las Carnes were not displayed for many years after Gomez terminated their production. Perhaps it's because after information became widely available, they became simply too painful to look at. The sculptures sat in storage for decades collecting dust. Sometimes they were shown individually, but never as a series, and never quite in the same fashion as the shows of the period. In 2003, Daniel and Patricia Mammon rediscovered the works and immediately proposed to show them in their gallery. The sculptures, which were the result of the environment in which they were created, gained new resonance, speaking with the passing of time to who we were and what we are. They continue to speak when others remain silent, to perturb when others remain complacent, to shed light on the past when others are concerned with the future. Today, as more details about torture emerge, they take on new meanings as a part of an ongoing process of interpretation. They are not simply objects whose original significance can be objectively discovered or restored to a state of historical transparency. Rather, they are living entities whose message is sculpted by critics and audiences alike. While the pieces constituted electric moments at the time of their creation, touching those who had experienced pain and awakening those who are oblivious to the scale and depth of violence surrounding them, now they speak to a host of other issues. Viewers today in the United States might perceive the works like the genre of political art to which they belong in light of September 11th, or with the legacy of colonialism in Latin America. Like the paintings of the great masters, they might be seen as transcendent critiques of violence or war, or with regard to particular contemporary conflicts such as our involvement in Iraq. However, I believe the most politically salient reading is one which remains cognizant of the context of torture and dehumanization, one which forces society to look at realities which are difficult, indeed nauseating, to face head-on, and one which examines state practices against those who are deemed different, threatening, and expendable. The closest present-day parallel, which might benefit from such analysis, is, I would suggest, Abu Ghraib. Like prisoners in Argentine centers treated as animals by their captors, detainees in Iraq are denied basic standards of personhood. They are cordoned off from society, turned into faceless, naked, and physically subjugated entities. They have no right to names, to speech, to any form of individuality. And, like the protagonists of Las Carnes, they are subjected to sexual sadism, where pleasure is derived directly from their pain. Yet I would argue the most important lesson Gomez's sculptures have to teach us is not the manner in which the members of the military or the intelligence community justify their treatment of subversives or leftist terrorists, but the voyeuristic participation of the viewer in this process, the viewer who sees, who stands in close proximity to the works, and who ultimately has agency over their response. What is the lesson that we, as art historians, professors, students, and community members can take from these pieces, from the photographs of Abu Ghraib? Do we turn away in disgust? Do we gawk in awe? Or do we internalize them, contemplate them, let them simmer in our minds? For it is precisely this display which permits the potential for corporeal reconstruction. Only by showing how the military fragmented and dismissed subversives can permit the recovery of their parts as constitutive of a whole. Paradoxically, it is through an art of violence, destruction, and dehumanization that the seeds of nonviolence and humanity are planted. Thank you.
I'm going to take my prerogative as the moderator to make a slight change in the order of speakers because listening to court here, it seems like it makes more sense actually for Ines to speak first and to have Marguerite complete the remarks. So forget what I said earlier. I'd like to now welcome Ines Katzenstein to remark.
Thank you. Is this working?
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks of all. First of all, I would like to thank this Dickey Center for having invited me to participate in this panel. Actually, for having invited me to come from Buenos Aires, which is very far away. And I want to congratulate Court for her wonderful thesis, and very especially for having chosen to work on Norberto Gomez, who is an artist who's not the most obvious one to choose when one studies the 70s in Argentina, and is actually the most difficult one to choose. So in that sense, I think she was very precise and very brave. On the other hand, before reading my presentation, I want to apologize for my English, which is really bad, and my accent is gonna get thicker and thicker while I read it. So I'm sorry for that. What I'm gonna do is to read a brief text that I wrote on Gomez and his context after having read Court's thesis, and I hope you enjoy it. In response to the Cuban Revolution, called by Argentine writer David Viñas the Revolution in Spanish, and in parallel with the liberation movements that took place during the 60s throughout the world, Argentina became, during that decade, the site of a growing politicalization with radical effects in the fields of art and culture. This process of politicalization, which was hastened by a conservative bloc that, starting in 1966 with the Onganía dictatorship, entailed increasing social repression in all areas of life, had several effects in the field of art. The politicization of the works of art themselves, the transformation into messages, the will to dismantle individual authorship, and a sometimes violent attack on art institutions, considered by several artists of the period as parts of a bourgeois system removed from the people. Politicized artists were involved in a process of radical self-criticism that brought them face to face with a dilemma: either to keep producing autonomous works of art for the elitist public that they condemned, or to radically change direction. Some of these new directions are encapsulated by two leading figures of the avant-garde scene of the 60s, Roberto Jacobi and Leon Ferrari. In 1968, Jacobi wrote, I quote, "The future of art is connected not to the creation of artworks, but to the definition of new conceptions of life," end of quote. And Ferrari wrote, quote, "Art will be neither beauty nor novelty. Art will be efficaciousness and disruption. The successful work of art will have an impact on the artist's medium that is somewhat parallel to the impact of a terrorist attack in a country that is being liberated," end of quote. This radicalization of thought, characterized by Argentine scholar Beatriz Sarlo as a real fusion of politic and aesthetic avant-gardes, led some of the most brilliant Argentine artists of those years to find themselves at a dead end. Since all the elements that traditionally constitute the institution of art were in question, many artists found themselves forced to abandon the art field and turn to politics, to leave the country, or to simply retreat to solitude and inactivity. What is strange is that if one analyzes the evolution of key artists from the 60s, one finds that the break from art production generally went from the end of the 60s until 1976, the year when the most violent military dictatorship in Argentine history was established. If on the political level, the dark years of the so-called proceso, which is the dictatorship, meant generalized depoliticization, social repression, police raids, censorship, forced exiles, and the execution of a state-sponsored program for the extermination of the left, which ended in our 30,000 disappear. On the level of aesthetic production, those years meant a return to traditional techniques, to solitary studio work, and a renewed acceptance of the elements that constitute the institution of art: an elite public, a market, galleries, art as an autonomous object. But it is important to point out that this new situation in the field of art did not automatically mean silence or conservatism. In Argentina, during those years, the alternative was not at all to become a fascist complicit to the regime or a zombie paralyzed by fear. They were, as Sarlo put it, different strategies of the imagination put to work in order to survive the weight of authoritarianism. It is in this context that Norberto Gomez and other artists turned their backs on the avant-garde options of the 60s, and by means of objects and their return to craft, were able to record the extreme violence that characterized that historical moment. Between 1977 and 1983, Norberto Gomez produced a series of shocking works in which an aesthetic profanation of the body takes place. It is the striking impact of these works that makes them relevant to us. The effect of repulsion and solemnity is produced by their contact with the visceral, with the hidden. What I want to say is that Gomez's radicalness is related to the fact that these sculptures exhibit something that is normally hidden under the skin: flesh, innards, bones. And in this way, they break a taboo, the essential prohibition to see entrails and to treat them as a material. There is a level on which the shock is related to the simple visibility of what supposedly we must not see. And I maintain then that this visibility is the key to understanding this piece politically. Some days ago, in an article written in the context of the 30th anniversary of the coup d'etat, Argentine painter Luis Felipe Noé wrote, quote, "Art cannot change the world, but it can see, and blindness is no longer possible." End of quote. From my perspective, and in this I differ from Kurt's approach, what's political about this sculpture is not the way that they document a catalogue of tortures, but rather the non-compassive, relentless way in which they give visibility to the flesh and its pains, and the fact that this representation took place at a moment of extreme hidden violence against bodies. So it's not really important if there is a direct relation between image and representation, that is, between Gomez sculptures and the tortures carried out during the military dictatorship. Although this relation can be established, I believe that the exercise is, in the end, useless. What I think is that contemporary art, in this sense, does not operate by analogy, but rather by allegory or by material procedures. In her thesis, Ms. Kenney cites a statement by Gomez that is, I believe, crucial to an understanding of his work in relation to its sociopolitical context. In describing the political situation of the 70s, Gomez emphasized the ghostly quality of violence. He states that, I quote from your thesis, virtual war, that it was a virtual war where there was no right to pain, where there was no bodies or blood, where fear was not the result of a palpable reality. Instead, fear was caused by absence, end of quote. The 30,000 people disappeared by the state during the last dictatorship left their relatives and friends without answers or bodies, without flesh or cadavers. There was a dematerialization of the victims, and all that was left was absence. In this context, Gomez art operates as a tactile recovery of matter. And insofar as they are images of pain, I want to point out the way these pieces elude the metaphors traditionally used by expressionism or realism in the representation of suffering. What do I mean by this? Simply that although in Argentine art historians tend to think of Gomez in relation to other expressionist artists who work in the same context and with similar interest in the representation of human oppression, specifically Juan Carlos Di Stefano and Alberto Heredia, Gomez's works entails a difference that is an ethical difference. In his series, there is no theatricality or gesture. There is no portrait or identity. These pieces are, then, a discourse against a conventional expressionism of pain and against the realism of the face as the rally point for activist or documentary art, be it painting, sculpture, photography, or film. Gomez produces a tract against the epidermis, against physiognomy, against the ideological use of the face. Instead, his work depicts pain in living flesh, a representation of the cruelty inflicted on the flesh without mediation or context. Gomez's flesh has no identity. There's no clear indication whether it is human or animal. It is a vision of pieces, of parts, of remains, of mutilations. It is a pure metonymy of pain. What we do know, though, is that the tortures to which his work alludes speak to us of a war without rules, where ethical prohibitions have been surpassed. And, according to Georges Bataille, I quote, such cruelty is the specifically human feature of war. Gomez's mastery implies a logic of effect, because for the disruption to work, the simulacrum must be perfect. The artist created a technique to represent flesh and bones, a simulacrum of contorted, begging, and deformed animal matter. Its appearance of softness and plasticity in the case of flesh, and its shine, colors, and transparency in the case of the bones. The anatomical simulacrum is so well rendered that it produced the feeling of disgust that we will feel before the monstrous thing itself. Though, as Ms. Kenney points out, one can hardly look at Gomez's work. It is highly tactile. One's hands are tempted to touch this repulsive matter. And the parts are always ambiguous. In the case of organ, for instance, the shape does not seem to match any of our inner parts. Organo is a horrifying hole, a true malformation. Las parrillas, the grills, make explicit reference to Argentina as a carnivorous country. The carcass and bones sometimes look very human, though they are always deformed and incomplete, as if they have been subjected to the most frightful perversions. At the beginning of this talk, I said that this work entails an aesthetic profanation of the body. There is also the feeling that a certain abuse of sculpture takes place, as if someone had committed the sacrilege of handling organs in the interest of craft, braiding them, making them into a ball, knotting them, strangling them, cutting them. I would like to briefly refer to two works that, like Gomez's sculpture, are concerned with the problem of the body in a context of annihilation and the question of visibility in a culture of covert violence. One is perhaps the most emblematic work produced in Argentina in relation to the disappeared, and it's called the Siluetazo, a collective action carried out in September of 1983. Three artists, Julio Flores, Rodolfo Aguerreberri, and Guillermo Kexel, came up with the idea of paper in the center of power, the Plaza de Mayo, which is the plaza where all the public demonstrations and all the political demonstrations takes place, and where the Madres de Plaza de Mayo have been demonstrating for their children. So they came up with the idea of paper in the center of power, La Plaza de Mayo, during the third March of the Resistance of the Mother of Plaza de Mayo, a demonstration that took place after the Falkland War, a moment of crisis for the military government. During that demonstration, they draw collectively hundreds of silhouettes that represent the bodies of the disappeared. Julio Flores said, quote, "Each figure must be unique, multiple and unrepeatable, and the process of making it must be socialized quickly so that everyone participates in the protest." End of quote. El Siluetazo was an action aimed at making the absent present by giving them the status of standing, living men and women. The action replicated the absence of body in that they were where they should have been flesh, there was a void. At the same time, these shapes tried to give these bodies public visibility. The other piece I see as connected with Gomez's work is called Nosotros no sabíamos, we didn't know. And it consists of a large group of newspaper clippings with articles on the disappeared collected by artist Leon Ferrari between May 3rd and October 21 from 1976, when the artist left Argentina to live in exile in Brazil. The clippings are articles about the enigmatic appearance of anonymous corpses throughout the country, which were published in the local press, thus offering the population specific information about what was happening during the period. Day after day, Ferrari cut out the following titles: 30 corpses found in Fatima, 9 corpses found in a river in San Fernando, 30 exploded corpses found in Córdoba. The bodies of a murdered couple are found on a beach. Corpse appear. Another corpse is found in the Uruguayan coast, and so on. The title, Nosotros no sabíamos, makes ironic reference to the phrase by which Argentines hypocritically defend themselves and denied any knowledge of the consequences of state terror and any complicity with the military regime. The aim of the piece is to condemn this discourse through documentation of information that circulate publicly. But what interests us tonight is that the piece refers, like Gomez and the Siluetazo, to a fate of the bodies, the depersonalization, dehumanization effected by the state program extermination, bypassing the conventions of expressionism and political realism. Extraordinary mixture of Baroque fold and minimalist reduction, Gomez's work is exemplary insofar as it confronts the question of violence, eradicating metaphors, symbols, and anecdotes, only focusing excruciatingly on the hypothetical forms that it might take when it impacts in our bodies. Gomez knew that violence was not only a historical circumstance. He knew that abjection is inside us, humiliation and corruption are inside us. French philosopher Michel Onfray wrote, I quote, "Art is incarnating. It is a practice of incarnation since it set out to suture goons, to bring together the lips of goons in order to be incarnated, for the blow to become scar, a vague mark on skin or art, on flesh or being," end of quote. Gomez's sculpture gave us an ethical and aesthetical lesson regarding incarnation. For him, it was necessary to delve into the body to study the forms that pain might take and to engage in the exercise of molding the inside of the goons before closing them. Thank you.
I too would like to extend my thanks to the Dickey Center and my congratulations to Court. This is really quite a lovely bringing together of various strands of my experience. A Lexicon of Terror, the book I wrote on the legacies of torture in Argentina, was in fact dedicated to Marshall Meyer. And in fact, Ines and I worked together on a project years ago at MoMA, but this is the first time we've actually met. We had an intense correspondence over telephone and email, but so this is particularly lovely. I would like to talk about a couple of themes that you raise, and I think the connecting thread, if you will be this notion of what you call the hidden and the public transcript. And one of the things microphone. Did anyone hear any of that? Okay.
You spoke a little closer.
Oh, just hold, okay. I don't have to manipulate.
Right.
That's good enough? Okay.
I take it from there.
All right.
Thank you.
So my through line, if you will, is going to be this theme of the hidden and the public transcript. Let me also say that in my experience, Argentines are extremely savvy about what is the ostensibly public transcript, the ostensibly hidden, and playing with manipulating the two. A peculiarity about Argentina is that the modern Argentine state is generally located at 1930 with the violent coup of General Uriburu. And so you can say there's been an historical conflation of repression, which is to say archaicizing repression with modernity, with the modernizing of repression. So these two things are very strongly braided together through Argentine history. I want to also, by way of framing my comments, just to, and I'm not going to give you a lot of examples from my primary researches because I think we've sort of, we've seen Norberto Gomez and that's upsetting enough. But let me just say a couple of things. This issue of seeing and not seeing is not just in a drama for visual artists and for theatrical artists. It is very much a drama of what we might call real life in Argentina. And let me just give you two anecdotes. No sabíamos nada. I was told this scores and scores and scores of time during the 6.5 years of my primary researches. Often people would then sort of slide into a kind of stream of consciousness in which they would in fact recount a kidnapping they had seen but had suppressed. This happened enough so that I have to say it was more than anecdotally significant. There was a widespread, though much of the violence was of course hidden, enough of it was seen to preclude the vast numbers of people saying with any truth, we knew nothing. So just two quick anecdotes. When I was just beginning my researches, I needed to find a place where I could make photocopies. And this was a difficult thing because of the manner of the materials I wished to have photocopied. I was living, for those of you who know Buenos Aires, and Calle Bulnes, between Corrientes and Humahuaca, right in the neighborhood called Almagro, a mixed, quite wonderful neighborhood. Around the corner from my street, a block and a half away, was another street, Sayero, and there was a stationery store. And I very gingerly would go in there, buy a newspaper, buy a pen, buy a notebook, make a couple of copies. It was pretty clear after about a month that I was up to something and needed the confidence of the person in the shop. And yet I hesitated. And one day I came in to buy yet another pen. I had millions of them by this time. And he said, I want to tell you a story. I said, okay. And he had a big sort of window out onto the street. And he said, you see the bus stop, because the bus passed right on this street up to Palermo. And he said, it was in June of 1976, which is to say in the first trimester of the Dirty War dictatorship. And he said, and people were lined up to take the bus as usual. Ford Falcon came up, which was the Secret Service car, took a young man who was 19. They sort of had him step forward from the line. They shot him dead. The car pulled off. A few moments later, another car came, and they sort of shoveled him into the boot of the car, and that car drove off. And a few minutes later, the bus pulled up, and everybody who was waiting got on the bus and went to wherever they were going. Now there was, this young man was killed with a lot of blood, and there was a lot of blood on the sidewalk. And as many of you know, it's the responsibility of shopkeepers to keep the sidewalk outside their shop door cleaned. And every morning and every night you can see people mopping down their sidewalk. And this gentleman said, I decided that I would not clean up the blood because I wanted to see what people would do. Would they step around it? Would they step on it? Would they cease to catch their bus at this particular stop? What would happen? And so he ran this and I should say, extremely dangerous experiment to him, because it, I should think, would have been understood that part of his job as citizen was being defined in these years, was to erase the traces of this action. And he said, happened to be a pretty rainy June and July, and soon enough, the blood shrank, it darkened, it got washed away. But he said, and what was extraordinary was that people still came to the bus stop, day after day. Another story about a bus by a woman named Susana Barros, who rode the same bus home from work every evening, right down Rivadavia, which is the main, or one of the main boulevards through Buenos Aires, goes right out through much of the province of Buenos Aires. She got on the bus, she paid her fare, she turned to take a seat toward the back, and she got about halfway down the bus, and two plainclothes officers got on. She had long hair. She could sit on her hair. She was very proud of being able to sit on her hair in 1978. 1979, I'm sorry. They pulled her by her hair back up the bus, and what Susana remembers is that nobody said a word. What she remembers is the total silence, except for a woman sitting very close to the front of the bus who said, por el pelo no, not by the hair, please, not by the hair. So by the time this bus finished its normal route, Susanna had been stripped and tied naked to a metal cot where she was electrically tortured. Not one person ever came forward to testify about this event. The only report we have of it is Susanna's. So I can only speculate that everybody remained faithful to the strictures of routine and rode to their stop. These are, as performance theorists might say, theatricals. Theatricals, which is to say the performance, the acting out in public space of internalized commands. This is a great part of what makes Argentina so fascinating and so difficult. And it is also a dynamic that goes all through the theater of Griselda Gambaro, which is the other artist that you deal with. Political repression in Argentina is historically extremely theatrical, from the militaristic Uriburu to the spectacularly fascistic Perón, to the sort of modern strongman of Onganía, to the creation of the secret world that we saw during the Dirty War. At the trial of the ex-commanders in 1985, people were stupefied to have researched the existence of 340 some odd secret concentration camps and torture centers. At the 25th anniversary of the coup, because researchers had continued, that figure was raised to 730 some. 730 some. Actually, 737 is the last figure I saw. Secret concentration camps and torture centers. This is an enormous, I guess we would have to say, achievement. Not that we are praising that accomplishment. So I want to leave you with that image. It's a very important image because I would like to talk about another play by Griselda, which was literally part of the hidden transcript for many, many years. It's a play called Información para Extranjeros, or Information for Foreigners. It has in common Griselda's habit of snipping headlines and articles from the newspaper. Griselda Gambaro, for those of you who don't know, was born in 1932. Since 1962, in plays that run now to 8 collected volumes and a number of other uncollected plays and several novels and a volume of short stories, has addressed and deconstructed the theatricality of political power in Argentina as the dynamics, as the forms or modalities of that power, exercise of power, style of power has changed, so too has her theater undergone stylistic evolutions, we could say. Información is truly a prophetic work. It was written from 1970, 1971. She completed it in late 1971. And it foretold the whole coming era of state terrorism. Información began because Griselda was getting a very nervous feeling reading the newspaper, somewhat similar to the feeling you got when you stood before the Norberto Gomez sculptures and you had this terrible sense that something was very wrong. Griselda was reading these articles in the paper, realizing that it just didn't add up. And she knew some of it was legit, shall we say, some of it was clearly fabricated by the secret services who had infiltrated much of the Argentine press. She constructed a play that, again, takes this, what is hidden and what is not only visual, but a shared visual experience. Let's remember, we go to the theater at an appointed time and an appointed play to watch, and to do so collectively in company with other people. This whole notion of watching and seeing and sharing public space was extremely dangerous during the dictatorship for obvious reasons. Griselda's play is a chronicle she calls it a chronicle in 19 scenes. In fact, there are 20 scenes. Griselda doesn't count well. And so we just kept it a chronicle in 19 scenes because it's such a kind of delicious mistake. People go, this is to be performed in a warehouse or a big house. Audience members arrive. People are immediately separated from whomever they came with. Each group is assigned a guide. And each group goes through the space, which is to say, through the scenes, from one space, one room, a corridor, a stairway, another room. And what Griselda has described it as a guided tour of the places of infamy and death. And that's exactly what it is. There are scenes of traditional dramaturgy. There are scenes of what you might call high grotesco criollo, which is a style of theater that is very much marked by black humor, by popular theatricals, by the sardonic. People go through these scenes in a different order. She's very careful in these scenes that there be no possibility of jouissance, that there is absolutely no eroticizing of the violence, because this is a very great danger, human beings being, alas, what human beings are. She is also very careful to bring our attention to the fact that this is artifice, that this is created, that this is acted. And some of these scenes consist of blatantly bad acting. She does everything possible to break the theatrical illusion. Why? So that the audience will say, but that does happen. But that's true. But I always thought that was the case. And so it is an effort to, make one very aware of what one is seeing and what one thinks about one is seeing, but also it's a play about the audience. Because as we look at these scenes, as we make our way up and down these stairways, we see other groups coming toward us. And so we are part of the action as watchers. The last scene, the 19th or 20th, is one where everyone converges. And so it is that act of being reunited with those from whom you have been separated, knowing that you have seen what you have seen, I have seen what I have seen, and now what? The final moment of the play, when the audience makes its way out with one foot on the street, one foot on the threshold, a police siren goes off. Is that part of the show? Is it not part of the show? Do you stay in this place that you know is a place of torture? Do you go out into the street where there's a police siren, always a bad sign? In Buenos Aires, what? What do you do? The crisis comes when you leave the theater and go out into the street. And so I guess I'm a little curious. One of the big differences, let me put it this way, Decir sí, or saying yes, is a play that sets up a very strong fourth wall. As you described the action, this is something that we watch. It has nothing to do with us necessarily. Información is all about something else. Griselda made this play, as she said, to be an impossible play. You can imagine the logistics are diabolical. And yet, every time I've taught this play, students have done it. It's been done at Harvard, it's been done at Princeton, it's been done at the University of Iowa, and it's been done very ingeniously. So I'm very interested that there seems to be this sense that it's needed, that this exercise is somehow needed. A couple of other things I think might be interesting to talk about. You mentioned Pavlovsky, who is, of course, Well, actually, before I go on to Pawlowski, I want to say another thing about Griselda. She was forced into exile in 1977. She, and this was absolutely a death threat. She left within 36 hours. And when she was in Barcelona in exile for 3 years, she could not write any plays. She was totally blocked. And she realized that this was because she was separated from her audience, that theater for her, and I also want to take a little bit of issue with something that one of your sources says about theater. I think you quote Diana Taylor, who's a good colleague and good professional friend, who says that theater historically has been very suspect in Argentina as a kind of high-class art. Let me say, I really disagree with that. I think that theater has been, and you may have a view on this, theater has been extremely confrontational and extremely wily in Argentina. And even when you think about the latest economic collapse, all of a sudden in a country that literally had no money, everybody's doing theater. I mean, it's extraordinary. And the other thing I would say then about Griselda, there's somebody quotes, you quote actually, somebody whose name I can't remember, and I apologize for it, a scholar who said that Griselda writes all these stage directions, and by way of saying that this would seem to indicate that even in a playwright so concerned with confronting violence, there is yet a kind of, it's almost impossible to escape a dictatorial tendency in oneself. I can't disagree with that strongly enough, with all due respect. Griselda writes, and I've translated hundreds of pages of her stage directions because she has one foot in narrative, and because when she writes, she acts out all of the roles. And so she writes down what she does, picks up a cigarette, has a swig of whiskey, etc., etc., etc. But when she's in production, those things go right out the window. She has very fluid, very communal relationships with her directors. And at some point, when you're in Buenos Aires, you might speak with Laura Jusem, for example. So I somehow just couldn't let that go by. I don't mean to be pedantic, but I think it's kind of an example of somebody with a theory and fastening on a detail to fit the theory. Having been at a lot of rehearsals and having worked with Griselda, I just know that's not the case. Couple of other things I just and I don't want to go on too long because I think we want to have a sort of a group discussion. I want to say I so admire that you registered the visceral reaction you had to the work of Salkowski and then to Gomez, that you stuck with it through all of this psychic pain, through all of the challenges to your own lucidity that such work animates. You're to be commended and congratulated. I think that you took on work that is extremely rough as an experience, and that arises out of a disorienting context. You held on to your empathy, you held on to your lucidity, and brava.
I want to again thank all three of our speakers for their presentations today, and to say that it's the height of, well, in addition to the explicit compliments that were given, it's also the height of compliment when real figures in the field can engage at a very substantive level your scholarship, and that's an incredible honor that we don't always get. And so I would like to open the discussion up to our audience members who may have questions or comments or responses. And barring that, if that does or doesn't occur, then I'd also like to open up the conversation between our three speakers and give them an opportunity to speak to one another after having the benefit of hearing each other. So, yeah, Catherine.
This question is for Court. You said that Gomez's work, there has been a lot of scholarship on it, and that it hasn't been discussed a lot, and I was wondering why you think that is and whether that's changing.
I think that's an excellent question. I myself wonder why it hasn't received more attention, because of all the artwork that I saw, and I saw quite a few artists. I saw Juan Carlos de Stefano, Alberto Heredia, many other figures in Argentine art, particularly during the 70s, and of them all, Gomez's works impacted me the most. So I was pretty surprised that it hadn't received more attention. I think there are a couple of reasons probably why it hasn't. The first is that Gomez didn't display quite as frequently as some of his contemporaries. He produced far fewer pieces than Juan Carlos de Stefano, and he was kind of guarded about them. In fact, actually, I didn't mention it in my talk today, but there were several curators who refused to display his pieces because they were so kind of out there. And so I think, and also just in general as an artist, he was very particular about the places that he showed. So I think that just he had much less circulation than some of his contemporaries. I also think that while he's attached to his artworks, he doesn't sell them as much either. So there are fewer pieces in private collections of his. I interviewed Jorge Halft, who's one of the most important art collectors in Argentina, and he said he pretty much had everyone, but he didn't have any pieces of Gomez, and I think that's really interesting. And then I would also argue that the last question has to do with their difficultness. I think that it's very hard to look at these pieces, and I'm not sure if you could tell from my presentation, but I almost threw up after seeing them the first time. And I went to see them and I said, wow. And it was very, very difficult for me to write them and very difficult for me to look at them every day. I had to staple them on my wall in my dorm room when I was writing this project, and it was difficult to see them every day. So I think that it's hard to find people who are willing to take on that type of visceral art. I think most scholars would prefer to, discuss the great masters or things that are kind of easier to cordon off or at least separate from you. So those would be my postulates. But I'm very happy because I believe that Ines is now going to be writing about him. So I'm thrilled with that.
Can I add something to yours? Because I think you're right about many things, about the fact that Gomez hasn't shown a lot in Argentina, and also the reason of the disgust of the works. But I think there are perhaps other reasons. One is that there's not much scholarship in Argentina. Lately, in the last 15 years, I think there's much more interest and much more possibilities for young scholars to work seriously on contemporary art. But I would say that the people who have written on Norberto Gomez have been people writing mostly in the 80s and beginning of the 90s, and it's in general people who are not working in universities, but people that come more from literature or kind of like a belles lettres kind of writing and like journalist. So there is a lot of things written about Gomez, but it's not the kind of work that Kurt has done in the sense of length and kind of research and focused. So that's important. And another important thing, and that's is a supposition, is that it has to do with some kind of anachronic language of the work. I think Gomez is not an artist who works with a contemporary language. Is not working with, was working in the 70s and beginning of the 80s, and he was not dealing with conceptualism the way the kind of more canonized artists of the decade were working, and I think that's another important reason.
Oh, I just thought of something else. Gomez is also a fairly reclusive person. I mean, he lives outside of Buenos Aires. When I interviewed him, he would talk about the discotecas in Buenos Aires and how much they annoyed him, and he, moved outside of the city to escape them. So I think that it's partially that he's just kind of not a very social person, and I think that one really has to display interest in his work in order to get to know him, which I was fortunate enough to do.
I was just curious if the same situation or so similar situation in Chile produced any coupled, type of artistic expression. Do you or anybody ever panel this one?
I'm really embarrassed to admit that I don't know the answer to that question. I actually, when I was writing this talk, I thought it would be very nice to talk about Chile as well and say, hey, there's an analogous trend, etc. But I didn't have very much time to research it, so I did a couple of Google searches and it didn't turn up anything. Then again, Gomez. I mean, you'll find a couple of images on the internet, but not that much. So I think that there is, because Nellie Richards, who is a very famous Chilean scholar, she's sort of like the Latin American version of Foucault. I mean, maybe that's a little strong, but she's quite well known. Who works at Arces University in Santiago. She does a lot of scholarship about modern art, and I think the quote that I used about the alphabet of survival comes from Nellie Richard discussing art produced in Argentina during the Pinochet regime. So I assume that there has been art produced there, but I personally have not had the opportunity to see it.
There is.
Okay, thank you. Okay.
It takes different forms, and this will be very generalized, but I think that actually Marguerite and Ines might be able to speak to this issue as well. One of the things about the Chilean response to political violence is that it takes on a very theatrical dimension and a real harm to the body. That is, the artists that are most well known on the Avanzada, Carlos Lepe, Diamela El Tit, and I'm blanking on the last name I want to mention here, subjected their own bodies to forms of extreme self-enacted torture or abjection as a way of dramatizing the erasure of public and private space under conditions of surveillance, as well as to sort of perform forms of taboo in public, and as well as to literally become almost embodiments of the forms of socialized terror, or the sort of violence toward the social body, to become sort of vectors of that at the personal level. So this took forms of scarring, pouring acid on one's face, to kissing homeless people who were living in the streets, to ritually washing the streets in front of bordellos, to Carlos Lepe did a whole series of performances that become increasingly abject and difficult to watch because of what he subjects his own body to and what he performs. So yeah, I mean, in a very general way. And there are other forms that are not quite so embodied, but are very working with a very conceptual and abstracted language, like Lottie Rosenfeld or someone like that, who works at the level of changing public signage as a way of demonstrating kinds of action. So there are, although I can't think of anyone from the Chilean context, and that doesn't mean that they don't exist, that I would working like Gomez does in this very visceral, and as Ines points out, and I think very important comment, in a way that in many ways is quite traditional and sort of traditional object making, and yet in the very act of bringing this kind of material or this simulacra into this traditional kind of object making gives a kind of civility to the sort of body in pieces that forces us to engage with the work in a much more visceral way, which is something that comes out in Cort's work. But I'd like to hear if you have. I know that Marguerite was also going to speak about Doris Salcedo in the Colombian context.
We can do that in a moment. I think Ines was about to talk about Chile.
Oh, I just wanted to point to, this is not working, no? I just wanted to point to an action made in Chile that was very important, that basically consisted of artists writing in the streets the word no and the sign more, no más. So that graffiti in the streets that was basically dangerous to do became very important because other people, like the civilians, started completing the phrase no more torture, no more militaries, no more suffering. And I think it's a very interesting action in the way they present a possibility for the people to express themselves and to kind of complete the phrase. Of course, many of those actions were like censored, but I think it's an interesting example of a different kind of response to this kind of violence.
Interesting. There's another that puts me in mind of Cecilia Vicuña, who is a poet and performance artist, and just plain visual artist as well. She did an action in the early 90s during a milk crisis, when the price of milk just shot up astronomically and almost inexplicably, and she just poured milk on the sidewalk in various places in Santiago, and just let it be. And that also engaged the public in much the way that you were saying, that she didn't provide any words to go with the spilled milk, but it impelled people to describe, to associate, to accuse, etc., etc. Which is the other thing I would like to mention. Guillermo Núñez was a Chilean political prisoner who did an extraordinary book of his captivity, which is poetry and drawings. He did it he put together a sketchbook of scraps that he could find, and it's actually quite a beautiful work, and he made it for his daughter, hoping that he would see her again, which it turned out he did. He did survive his ordeal. And it's very beautifully translated by Kola Franzen, not easily available, but Dartmouth Library may well have it. But it's, I think, one of the treasures of that period.
I'm intrigued by this phrase "no mas" because it's not accusatory. It invites the creation of narrative, and it's democratic and involving a forking of narrative and an acceptance of different ways of continuing history or continuing commentary. And I'm struck by that because when I look at Roberto Gomez's work, the court's going to disagree with me here, but it suddenly occurred to me while you were talking about it that we don't even get a hidden transcript in a sense. We get no transcript. There's no narrative because to look at this work in isolation can only be the end of narrative. If you look at these objects, it's like this filthy punctuation mark. You can't put back together anything from it. And so a question for me is, in fact, how do you get the audience into Gomez's work? And of course, you thought about part of it. If you strip away the layers of knowledge of the dirty work, if you strip away the understanding of the place of meat in society, then is there a beginning point for narrative that leads us in the works?
I actually don't disagree with you. I think that one of the reasons I was so upset about my computer not working is because I was afraid that I would not be able to show the images today. And everyone said, oh, your descriptions of the pieces are so compelling, it's fine. And my kind of internal thought process was, well, I disagree because no matter how much I write about these pieces, there's no way to experience them without seeing them. And so I think it is the end of narrative. And I think that it's precisely the viscerality of the pieces and the emotional reaction that viewers have to them, which makes them powerful, which makes them compelling. And so I think the fact that they take away language from the viewer and they leave you speechless. I mean, most people who I observed in the gallery came out sputtering. And I mean, some of them started yelling at the pieces. Some of them said, oh, this is horrible. I can't believe anyone would create art like this. And some people cry. I mean, people have extreme reactions to this art. It's not something that you're like, oh, there's another Monet. It's it's not. You can't be neutral with regard to this art. So I think that while it might not leave space for language, it does provide avenues for other emotional reactions to the work. And I think that that's important because I think getting back to this whole question of silence in Argentina, that people denied themselves the ability to think about this stuff because it's not just, no sabíamos, but that people really didn't want to see. there was a willful blindness, and that they didn't allow themselves to contemplate this type of stuff, because then it might make them culpable, or it might mean that they should do something. And so I think that this artwork brings the viewer back and forces them to think about this stuff. And that's kind of what I was concluding by, in terms of looking at images that are painful for us. I mean, we don't like looking at the photos of Abu Ghraib. I don't like looking at them, but it's important that we do it in order to come to terms with it and move beyond it.
Another way to look at things like that is through, for example, novels such as Isabel Allende's two novels, her earliest two novels about the repression and the horrible things that were happening in Chile. How do you compare that? I mean, when I read that, I have a very vivid impressions about what she's describing, what's going on, but I've never experienced seeing the things that you're writing about.
I mean, I don't think that you can prioritize art over text. I think that there are different types of experiences, and I think other people would probably be more qualified to speak to this. I mean, I personally cried when reading my sources for my thesis, either scholarly works describing the events or even plays, so I think that they can also elicit a reaction. I think it depends. That would be my take. I'm not sure which novels you're referring to, by the way.
Well, the Casa de los Espíritus in De Amores Sombras.
Well, I'm not entirely sure Casa de los Espíritus. I mean, I think the ending, yes, is about the dictatorship, but I think that that's also about a variety of other issues that are kind of...
Three generations, I guess.
Right, exactly. And I think it's also kind of based on Gabriel Garcia Marquez's Cien Años de Soledad. I would say it's like a feminist rewriting of that work that has less to do with the dictatorship than with her kind of dialogue with the Colombian author. But yes, I do think that text is incredibly powerful. And although I wrote about theater, the other piece that I analyzed, Desierci, I never saw it staged. I only saw production stills of it and read the text, but it still impacted me. So I think that there's definitely room for expression and through words.
I was wondering, just this question has actually given us the opportunity to bring all three of the talks together in an interesting way, around the issue of an object and the ways in which we encounter an object and theatricality or performance, which is different than reading, in ways that I think Marguerite made really palpable for us tonight, and as well as in her performance of her anecdotes, which is different than even if we were to read those, I think, because of the qualities of voice and modulation and the pauses. And I'm wondering, I'm thinking of some other writing that I've been reading lately on, well, there's a funny anecdote by Felipe Solars about Lacan, where he says, Lacan was a terrible writer. Freud was this really fascinating writer and this sort of a very literary character, and his writing is very much a part of the literary tradition, and Lacan is, you have to keep, there's sort of routes, and you have to keep coming back to it, and it doesn't have the same kind of power as a text. He said, but when you saw Lacan perform his lectures, this is why he has this amazing following, because there was a world of difference between reading a Lacan lecture and seeing him do it. And the reason I'm raising this in this moment is because I think that this is something that actually links the ways that Ines was trying to talk about the analogic versus the, and I'm going to forget the great distinction that she made, allegorical ways that artists deal with violence. As well as with the ways in which Marguerite was describing this incredible play by Griselda Gambaro that puts you through an experience and leaves you at the threshold of the performance with the crisis. That is, it doesn't dramatize or narrate the crisis. It puts you in the position of having to, of experiencing a crisis, and that there's something different than reading a narrative account of that or of watching a play. So this isn't a question, but rather just an invitation to see if, to sort of think again about the three presentations around, I think art historians in particular in this moment are thinking in much more, I think, interesting ways about how to talk about the dimensions of the work that Ines was describing, not works about violence that are descriptive or expressive, but rather that work through what we might even describe as a pre-symbolic moment. That is, a moment of encounter that before you have time to sort of pull it into a language or a narrative or a set of codes to interpret it, is already working on you and has already radically disorganized your sense of self. And when you describe, when you quote, I think Noe, who says, art can't change the world, but it sees. And that's, I think, also an interesting way to try to describe that.
And I believe that in the case of Gomez is, for me, is rather strong how the work looks like a distillation of something. You know, there's no more than meat or bones. There's nothing else. There's no composition with something else. There's no combination of elements. That's what it is. It's like almost like a literalness of body, of corpse, that becomes, from my point of view, the strength of the work. No, this kind of like idea of leaving everything aside. There's no more than meat or flesh. And I think for me that's crucial in Gomez, in relationship, and that's why I wanted to distinguish him from the rest of other very good Argentine artists that dealt more with the gestures of violence, you know, with like, how do you say, ¿cómo se dice? Cuando te ponen una cosa para que no hables, por ejemplo.
Tabicado. Tabicado.
Yeah, in gag.
Oh,
like
gag,
for example,
sorry.
a gag or a grito, a scream, right? These more stereotypical symbols and gestures of violence or suffering, and I think that the incredible mastery of Gomez is to go absolutely beyond that. That's what I basically wanted to say.
You know, one thing occurred to me, and it's just occurred to me, so this is not totally thought through, but I think that Gomez does invite us to make some kind of narrative. And I was thinking, and again, forgive me for being a tad pedantic here, the piece Colgado, which you translate as the hanged one, is really just hanged. And just hanged, which, well, and I think that the translation difference is important because it's not so much a question of, well, who is hanged? It's an interrogation of the action. What happened? What happened? Who did this? I think the other would be, well, okay. There was another translation where you inserted an article that made it very specific, where Gomez, it was just flesh. Not the flesh, it was just flesh. And I think these, as anybody who does literary translation knows, articles will be the death of you. They are just so difficult. But I think this, when you go on to publish this work in its final form, which I have every confidence you could do, that would be one little revision I would ask you to think about. Because I think he does. And I think I can't really improve on the way Court brought us through that, to say she has a whole series of beautiful questions on page 2, where she says, the artwork emblazoned itself on my brain. I wanted to investigate cultural responses to carnage. So this was, I mean, how did culture serve as weapon against domination? How did different artistic tropes engage and re-signify the rhetoric the military used to enforce its power and prestige? Were varying degrees of expressionism in art determined by censorship and oppression? These are really, I think, great questions, and to me, point to a process of the work that of itself resists, certainly doesn't provide a narrative, shifting the burden of creating a narrative to the viewer. And you more than stepped up to that challenge. Or at least, maybe narrative is the wrong word, but questions toward a narrative. Would you agree with that?
I don't know, again, can you repeat the last part?
Yeah,
What you mean is that it's a work that is open, that is not like an end point.
for sure.
That's what you
And
mean.
exactly, and where it's not the kind of work where the artist is both making the object and providing the story, but rather putting that object stripped, as you so beautifully laid out, and then shifting that challenge to the viewer.
Yes, but
No?
I agree with you, but I believe that I wouldn't talk about narrative, as you said, but I think the work is open in a strange way, because I think it's more about presence and about the impact of a presence. And I think for me, while you are in front of a Gomez work, you don't want to see because it's horrendous. Perhaps you want to touch just to see how that is done, how that effect of realism is achieved. Mm-hmm. But more than anything, I think you feel confronted with your own problem in front of death, flesh, torture. It's about our own fear of being in front of that. And I think that's the important thing.
Is that what you meant then when you said that the works are anachronic?
No. Anachronic in terms of language. I meant
okay.
in terms of like this is not the typical work of contemporary art.
Okay.
This is not related to any of the last 40 years of art trends in terms of language. It's more could be something made in the, 19th century, like very easily, and that a historical a quality that they have in terms of language, I think it's very specific and it's very unique. No, and it could. I think of it as an achievement, actually.
Mm-hmm. It was the ahistorical that I was interested.
Even though I believe it is very much related to minimalism and to his own formalist background, in the sense that is absolutely stripped out of anything that is not what he wants to engage with. In that sense, in the idea of the series of like to produce a complete series of meat and bones, and we could even think in a very far-fetched way, so there is the minimalist approach that I think it really impacts the work, and the problem of Baroque, which is very much related to that moment in Argentina, especially in the literary circles and in poetry, for example. There's like people like Osvaldo Lamborghini or Nestor Perlonger writing neo-Baroque literature. And I think, so that encounter between a Baroque idea of the body and like this minimalist approach to matter, I think it's very specific of that moment. And yet it looks like something, it can look at something done in 19th century, for example. I don't know if you agree.
I in general, yes, but I'm having a hard time thinking of a 19th century. I don't know. No, I know what you.
It's not very specific.
I think so, and it is, and it is in a dialogue with minimalism, and it's kind of formalist, and even the grills have a kind of. Almost like they could be cubes, only it's the material, the simulacra, that disrupts that kind of coolness. They're hot in that sense. You could never have the distance that you would take to a minimalist object with those objects. And it strikes me that there's a interesting artist in Brazil who's working now, Adriana Vajal, you probably know her work, that has a similar dynamic, although a completely different point of reference, far more an investigation of history, I think, and Brazilian discourses on modernity than the specific historical context that this work refers to, but it has a similar effect in that it's a simulacra, it's just foam and stuff, and yet it looks like entrails exploding from architectural and tile work pieces that, but she's working very much within a very legible discourse.
Yes. She's like absolutely crossed by neo-conceptualism in a way. That's why you can read her work as having an understanding of the work in a different way.
Do you foresee any large-scale exhibitions of his work?
Excuse me?
Do you foresee any large-scale exhibitions of the work?
I don't know. I hope
You
you can
hope-
see one. I hope so, yeah.
I think if there's one more question, we'll be happy to entertain it, but otherwise, even though we could go on up here for I think another couple hours, we probably do need to wrap it up by 6:30. So are there any other questions or comments? Well, then I want to thank our speakers again very much for really engaging with this project, obviously all the work that Court did, and then our two guest speakers engaging with such integrity and interest in her work and coming to speak with us, and just join me in thanking them one more time. Thank you one more time to the Dickey Center as well for giving us this incredible forum.